A warning that today's podcast deals with mental health issues and talks about suicide.
Lauren Dickerson is accused of murdering her 6-year-old and 2-year-old twins within weeks of the family arriving from South Africa. The 42-year-old admits killing the children, but is mounting a defence of insanity and infanticide.
Maternal mental health is in the spotlight thanks to the Lauren Dickerson murder trial. And as awful as the vehicle for it is, it's about time we talked about it. Along with periods, endometriosis and menopause, it's an issue that for too long has been hidden under the cloak of women's health issues. I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, a podcast of 2 parts. First, we're going to look at the law around infanticide, and then we'll talk about postnatal depression. What is it? Who's most likely to get it? And why there's some hope on the horizon for treating it. Chris Gledhill is a legal academic at the Auckland University of Technology. He teaches criminal law and has a particular interest in the overlap between law and mental health matters. He's written a piece for The Conversation spelling out what infanticide means.
So the first thing is it doesn't mean killing an infant. It's got a much more complex and legalistic meaning. So it's an offence which can only be committed by a woman. It has to involve a child of that woman who is under the age of 10 years. It has to be something which would otherwise be murder or manslaughter. But, and here's the kind of central provision for it, it has to involve the woman having, in the words of the statute, the balance of her mind being disturbed by reason of not having fully recovered from the effect of giving birth, or by reason of the effect of lactation, or by reason of any disorder consequent upon childbirth or lactation, to such an extent that she should not be held fully responsible. So it's a series of questions which involves, for the jury to decide, which involves there being proper medical evidence that there is some sort of mental disorder, that it's consequent on childbirth, lactation, or the effects of that. And then this evaluative judgment by the jury that the mental disorder is to such an extent that full responsibility for the killing is not an appropriate response from the criminal justice system.
So, infanticide is a partial defence to homicide, a claim in essence that the defendant had diminished responsibility. Infanticide is the only charge in New Zealand where you can claim diminished responsibility. Other countries, including the UK, have developed it as a partial defence in murder or manslaughter cases where there are mental health issues.
And basically, it's a halfway house between full insanity, which is there and leads to this special verdict, which used to be called not guilty by reason of insanity, and now in New Zealand is called acts proven, but not responsible on account of insanity. But that's a pretty high bar to meet, is the insanity test.
Dickerson is also using a defence of insanity.
If the disorder is worse and amounts to insanity in law, then we get on to language which kind of dates back to the 1840s, which is where the test for insanity that we currently have in New Zealand, where that originates. Now, the origin of infanticide as a separate offence is slightly later than the standard defence of insanity. And it comes about really because the insanity test is actually quite difficult to get to. But it was found, for all sorts of reasons, not really suitable to be executing women who'd killed their children. So to avoid the extremities of the death penalty, which of course used to be the mandatory sentence for murder, there's the creation then of this separate offence called infanticide, based on a diminished responsibility aspect to it, which allows the court to enter a conviction for something other than murder, and therefore avoid what used to be the consequence of a murder conviction, namely the death penalty.
How difficult is this to prove? Do you have to be, for example, have been treated for a mental health disorder after the birth of your children?
No. So what's required is a proper psychiatric evidence, and to get the psychiatric evidence about the state of somebody's mind at the time, it's always much more reliable, is that evidence, if it's involved somebody who's been treated very, very soon after the homicide has occurred, or who's been treated before the homicide occurs. So that goes to the quality of the evidence, not the requirement of it. But yeah, it's going to be more difficult to prove if you don't have contemporaneous medical evidence that somebody has the relevant disorder, that its origin is childbirth, lactation, etc. And of course, that, some psychiatrists find that slightly controversial.
Why?
Simply because there's some evidence around, or some viewpoints around, that it kind of pathologizes childbirth in a way that is inappropriate. I'm just saying that there are some people who question the use of infanticide. I'm perfectly happy with it from my perspective, because if there are doctors who come along and say these things exist, then that's what should be evaluated by the court.
Doctors, of course, do say these things exist, but just as importantly, women are starting to speak up about having experienced it, including some very high-profile women.
Adele admits to suffering from postpartum depression after giving birth to her son, Angelo James, 4 years ago. The Hello singer telling the magazine, "I had really bad postpartum depression after I had my son, and it frightened me."
And it just goes to show it can affect anyone, postnatal depression. It doesn't matter how rich, famous, successful you are, it can come get you.
No control over it. 1 in 10 women or more are affected by this within the first year of childbirth. And, it's devastating when it happens. You really feel in such a lonely place. You don't want to talk to anybody about it, as Adele said.
What help does a jury get during a trial to decide if a woman should not be held fully responsible, as you say, because of the extent to which the balance of her mind was disturbed from the effects of childbirth, lactation, or any disorder caused by childbirth or lactation?
The assistance they will get is from the closing speeches of the prosecution and the defence, and then the judge will give them directions on what the law is and what it means. And then it's over to the jury to kind of fit the evidence to the directions they've got. The judge will give them a question trail, is how we describe it, which will give them steps to think about as to how they reach their verdict, because they're going to have alternatives here. Is it insanity? Is it infanticide? If it's neither insanity or infanticide, then is it murder or is it manslaughter? So it's a complex trail that the jury is going to have to go through.
A lot of parents post-childbirth get the baby blues, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is about intense postnatal depression.
The real problem as to where the line is that it's incredibly subjective in the language of the statute. So, like I read out to you, the jury has to find that the effect of if they find that there's a mental disorder based on the medical evidence, the effect is that it goes to such an extent that she should not be held fully responsible. Well, what does that mean? Where's the line to be drawn there? So it is an incredibly evaluative judgment by the jury. It also means, for example, that two completely differently constituted juries could reach different verdicts on the basis of the same evidence because of the lack of certainty in the way that the law is drafted.
Well, you talk about two different juries could come up with two different answers, but two different psychologists could also come up with two different views, could they not?
Yeah, exactly. Psychologists and psychiatrists are probably as bad as lawyers, in the sense that if you put two of them together, you're going to get three different opinions about a particular factual situation. And clearly, if you know, on the reports that are coming through from the Dickerson trials, there's a whole host of expert witnesses giving evidence. They clearly don't agree with each other on everything, which is going to leave the jury in that position of trying to work out which one of the psychiatrists and psychologists has got an accurate description of what was going on in Mr. Dickerson's head at the time that she committed these killings.
I was at such a point of overwhelm and stress that I wasn't functioning as a rational person.
It was completely unexpected. You know, I started to have these panicked thoughts. I was very paranoid.
I changed as a person. You know, I wasn't the happy mom, happy life person. It was quite the opposite. I was afraid, worried about how people would view me if I had opened up and talked about what I was going through as a mom.
There just seems to be a stigma around it, which is a real pity because this is the time of a woman or birthing parent's life when, you know, they really need the support. And to be undergoing depression or anxiety or other forms of distress can be really, really hard. There are so many, you know, changes happening to this person. The whole family dynamic has changed. They're suddenly in charge of a brand new human being. And, you know, it's very overwhelming.
Dr. Felicia Lowe leads Koitu's Knowledge Hub for Maternal and Child Health at the University of Auckland, and she's our expert on postnatal depression.
There is some awareness, and it has been growing in recent years, but I think that there's still a huge amount that people need to learn about the condition and what can be done about it.
Is it just those feelings of being overwhelmed and of change and a new person coming into your life, or is it partly caused by some sort of chemical imbalance, or, you know, after you've given birth, your body changes? How much of that is a factor?
So it is a combination of all those factors. So there are definitely lots of hormonal changes happening during pregnancy and even after birth. So, for example, during pregnancy, there is a huge dramatic surge in estrogen and progesterone, and basically, almost immediately after birth, the levels drop quite dramatically as well. And so these are huge changes that the woman is experiencing. But also at the same time, like I said, it can be very overwhelming to be suddenly, you know, holding this brand new baby and, you know, feeling all this sense of responsibility for a brand new life and not knowing how things might happen. And of course, you know, throw in the fact that, you know, you've just given birth, it's been exhausting and tiring. And yeah, it's easy to imagine how it can all feel really overwhelming. But there is a difference between the baby blues and postpartum depression. So baby blues, yes, you do tend to feel a low mood or maybe mood swings. You may be crying for no reason. You know, lots of very heightened emotions. But baby blues tend to resolve by themselves over some time. So maybe up to 1 or 2 weeks, for example. But postpartum depression involves much more severe symptoms. So everything is heightened, and they last much longer as well. And if you recognize that that is what is actually going on, then that's when you really need to seek help.
So what is the pivot point? How do you know that this is just not normal?
Well, generally, if about 2 weeks after birth, if you're still feeling all those symptoms of distress, that's probably when you may be suffering from postpartum depression.
Is there some kind of genetic predisposition? Can we predict which women are going to be perhaps hit by this?
There is some evidence out there that there are certain genes or certain forms of genes that may put a woman at greater risk of developing postpartum depression, but we don't know too much about the details and exactly how that works. But what we do know puts women at risk of developing postpartum depression is some very deep societal issues. So we're talking about systemic inequities like poverty. That's a big one. So whether it's a lack of housing or housing instability, food insecurity, racism, maybe experiencing family violence, or just having a lack of education. And a very important one is a lack of social support. These factors can all really put a woman at greater risk. And also, perhaps some experiences that happened during pregnancy, such as having complications happening during pregnancy, or having a difficult or traumatic birth, or even having an infant that is, particularly temperamental, might not be feeding well or sleeping well. These can all really compound the issues that I mentioned before.
I mean, why is this in society? It's quite. I mean, lately we've been seeing issues like periods, menopause, endometriosis, all issues that are starting to come out from underneath the cloak of embarrassment, if you like. Is this another one of those issues?
Yes, quite possibly. I mean, it's really great that we're seeing a lot more talk, openness around, periods and period products and, using the terms more openly as well. And I think there's definitely some way to go still for postpartum depression.
I've heard figures anything from 1 in 7 to 1 in 10 people might go through this. Do we know what the figures are for New Zealand?
Yes, for New Zealand women, about 1 in 7 women, about 15%. Of women will experience postpartum depression. But we do know that some ethnic groups may be at greater risk. So, for example, Maori or Pacific or Asian women may actually, experience a higher rate of depression either during pregnancy or after birth.
The leading cause of death for women who are pregnant or have just given birth is suicide. Our rate is 7 times higher than the UK's, with wahine Māori making up a whopping 57% of all maternal suicides. Depression is often a silent struggle for new mums.
More than 1 in 5 Pacifica mothers in New Zealand experience anxiety or depression during or soon after pregnancy. That's the highest rate of perinatal depression in the country. But women of Pacific descent have low rates of assessing maternal mental health support.
We've got a generation of young women that are growing up in the New Zealand context who don't have the traditional supports of their homeland, but have already experienced significant amounts of psychological distress growing up here in New Zealand, that are much more vulnerable to potential mental health issues during and post-pregnancy.
Is that because of societal factors?
Most likely, yes.
And how do we know those figures are accurate if a lot of women don't speak up about them?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So these figures are quite likely to be an underestimate. So, the true number, nobody will really know for sure, but it is likely to be higher than 1 in 7.
What happens when you ask for help?
I think that's the most important step you can do for yourself and your baby. Because by looking after yourself, you are much better equipped to be able to look after baby. And I think that women should realize that, there should be no hesitation if they feel that there's something not quite right. They've been experiencing low mood. You may not even think it's severe, but if you feel something's not right, reach out to, it could be the well child provider, your lead maternity carer. So for most women, that would be their midwives, or their GP. These people would be able to refer them on to the appropriate services for help.
Because there are drugs that can help, aren't there?
There are now drugs that can help, yes. So very recently, the FDA in the US just approved this drug.
The FDA has officially approved the first ever pill for postpartum depression, which affects 1 in 8 new mothers. This pill could be a game changer because it works fast, it's accessible, and it's easy to take.
It's a synthetic version of this steroid that's derived from progesterone, the hormone. So in women with low levels of the steroid, it's called allopregnanolone. Women with low levels of the steroid are at greater risk of developing postpartum depression. And they've conducted trials and found that it's made a huge difference in women with severe postpartum depression. So this is a really big advance, because prior to that, there was just one drug available for postpartum depression, and it's also developed by the same company, but that was delivered as an IV infusion over 60 hours.
So you had to go into hospital for
You
that.
had to. It's an inpatient stay. So, and obviously if you're caring for a newborn, you're not going to just be able to drop everything and go into the hospital. So this new pill will make it much more accessible to, a wider proportion of the population.
Is that, it won't be available in the US, till the end of the year? But so goodness knows when we'll see it. Is that on the agenda to bring it here?
I would certainly hope so, because I imagine that, a lot of women may be very hopeful that it is available should they need it. But having said that, there are other options available for treatment. We do know that things like counseling or cognitive behavioral therapy, these sorts of interventions can be very helpful too.
Well, I presume also addressing the issues that led them down the path in the first place.
Absolutely. So really, we can't just look at, prescribing a pill or going to counseling without actually addressing the social determinants of health that I talked about earlier, poverty, food insecurity, family violence, and so on.
Isolation even?
Isolation, absolutely. So isolation, the lack of social support, we do know that a huge risk factor for developing postpartum depression is having experienced depression during pregnancy. And in turn, your risk of developing depression during pregnancy is dependent on experiencing depression before pregnancy. So this can all, track across the whole process of pregnancy and birth. And so if you have, prior experience of mental distress, mental illness, then it may be worth keeping a close eye on your feelings and thoughts and how you are doing after birth. These are all factors that really, really can determine whether it sort of pushes a woman over the edge and into developing postpartum depression.
What would you like to be done? What would you like to see? The first steps of trying to address this issue. Where do we start?
I think raising awareness of the issue, the possible impacts on both mum, baby, and the partner and wider family is just so important, because we need to build a support system around the family, and to do that we need help from everyone else, whether it's friends, the wider family, all supporting them like a village. So that's the very common saying, it takes a village to raise a child, and that's a proverb for a reason, because that's the best way to help new parents to overcome the difficulties in the early weeks and months of the child's life, and while they're still finding their feet on how to be parents.
If this podcast has raised issues for you, we've put links to helplines and other sources of information on RNZ and Newsroom's web pages. The Detail is supported by the Public Interest Journalism Fund. Today's episode was engineered by Mark Chesterman. Our producers are Sarah Robson and Bonnie Harrison. And thanks to Chris Gledhill and Dr. Felicia Lowe. Ka kite anō.